On Black Thursday, Herbert Hoover refused to go to Wall Street, choosing to take tea with Marie Curie, who was visiting the White House. He reminded her that he had been Secretary of Commerce before being elected president, and that America was sure of herself and would enjoy endless prosperity. At the same moment, outside the deserted stock exchange, ruined businessmen tried to sell their luxury automobiles for next to nothing.
The reaction, the official reaction to the crash of the market is a sense of shock, disbelief, and hubris, a sense that if they act and simply assure people that everything is all right, the market will immediately recover. John D. Rockefeller goes and buys some stock in a very public way to show that he too is confident that the economy is sound and the market is sound.
John Rockefeller, the richest man in the world, saw his fortune melt by 80%.
In the 93 years of my life, depressions have come and gone. Prosperity has always returned and will again.
It tries to assure everybody that the market is sound, that this is a temporary lull, and this act of buying up stock is a display of confidence in the market. And it doesn't work. Herbert Hoover, the president of the country, issues pronouncements that the underlying structure of the economy is sound, that people need not fear or panic. But everybody does indeed panic. And the panic is irreversible. It's extraordinary. It even has a sound to it. 10,000 people gather outside the New York Stock Exchange. The city is very afraid. They order mounted police. They think there's going to be a storming of the Bastille, that is a storming of the New York Stock Exchange. And that crowd gathers there and stays there for weeks and is a kind of low hum that kind of is emitted from the crowd, a kind of dull roar, a kind of, it's like the sound of panic, the sound of anxiety.
Crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange and market prices.
Herbert Hoover very, very quickly, once the crash hits, loses credibility in the eyes of the American people. He's doing nothing. He's making constant false assurances that always turn out to be untrue.
Did not recognize the crisis when it occurred. He tried to say it's not so bad, you know, we will recover quickly.
His statements about prosperity being around the corner were an attempt to give confidence to the market. No president is going to say we're about to have a disaster. But because they were false promises, when the reality showed them to be inconsistent with what they had said, it actually discredited Hoover.
The Congress and the president together could have appeared on the Capitol steps easily and said, we realize that what we're doing is destructive, but they didn't. And the president did not look back on the crash, apologize for having caused it, and express any regret for its policies. It's continued its policies as it had before.
He himself, I think, is so stunned by what has happened, so confident that the market will recover.
The Federal Reserve was saying that the stock market crash was no great deal, no great concern, nothing to worry about, and that it was not presaging any kind of economic downturn. Well, of course, that was a dead wrong assumption.
The crash was not the event of one day. It really spread out across a week, and it's sort of, the fall went on for almost 3 weeks, from late October into middle November. After that, the market began to recover, and it actually gained back during the winter something like a third of what it had lost. And it looked like recovery was on the way. Everybody was looking not at the market, but at the economy, what was going to happen.
On a du mal à croire qu'un événement déclencheur comme la baisse de la bourse, bon, qui perd tout de même presque 50% de sa valeur en quelques mois, ça a déclenché une telle apocalypse.
The crash on a particular day in 1929 was something like 24-25%. But actually, from 1929 to the bottom of the stock market, the entire decline was 80%.
In fact, Wall Street had already started its long, interminable descent into hell, and the whole of America's economic activity followed this downward slope until it reached the depths of the abyss.
It really snowballs after 1929. More and more banks fail. If you have money in a bank and the bank fails, you've lost it all. So that means there's a run on the bank, and there is literally a financial crisis.
American opinion was shocked by the collapse of what was once the indestructible bastion of triumphant capitalism, the banks.
People are desperate, and the banking system is collapsed. There's an enormous liquidity crunch. There's no credit available to restart the engines of the economy.
One of the controversies, 29, was what role did the central bank play? Would it have been able to reverse it if allowed, provided more money to the banking system?
The complete evaporation of confidence in the economy, and in the financial sector particularly, means there's no credit available.
So it was a period of falling, decline in economic activity that finally led to a financial crisis that then, of course, continued the downward spiral of the economy.
Suddenly, a banking community will not be able to lend money. People will not be able to buy houses. That feeds on itself, and that's how recessions work. Businesses start to lay off workers. They can't get loans to meet their payroll. They can't get loans to keep their businesses going. Businesses go out of business. More people are let go. Other people are afraid they will be let go. They stop spending. You spend less money. Business makes even less profit. More businesses go under. And all of this feeds on itself, and the economy sinks into this sort of death spiral, or at least coma spiral, let's call it. But that takes time. Markets can collapse in a few days, but the economy sinking takes time.
When the economy collapsed, there was no reservoir of consumer purchasing power to buoy it up again.
And people began to lose jobs. Then you get this shift. And once that mood shift starts, it's very, very hard to reverse again.
And so you get this escalating crisis that begins as a banking crisis, but becomes a general economic crisis.
L'enchaînement qui se met en place, c'est inquiet par l'effondrement de la bourse, les ménages suspendent un certain nombre d'achats de biens durables, et notamment d'automobiles, qui chutent brutalement en 1930. Les gens tout d'un coup perdent confiance, alors la consommation, l'investissement, les stocks s'effondrent. Les gens arrêtent pendant un an purement et simplement d'acheter des automobiles. À ce moment-là, ce secteur doit licencier, et les ouvriers de l'automobile qui sont licenciés, à leur tour cessent de consommer. En cessant de consommer, ils propagent la crise à d'autres secteurs qui à leur tour licencient, et en licenciant, on a un effondrement de la demande solvable. Plus personne n'est plus en mesure de consommer quoi que ce soit.
People stop buying things. They start worrying about the future, whereas before the future looked like nothing but bright because the market was going up. They had money. But as soon as the market crashes and the underlying causes start to seep in, like the housing market.
Dans les années 29, l'immobilier va jouer un rôle très important. Dans certaines villes, c'est 60% des ménages américains qui vont faire défaut sur leur emprunt. Quiconque est endetté au cours de cette époque ne peut plus payer, même s'il travaille. Tout d'un coup, les gens ne sont plus capables de supporter le poids de leurs dettes, font faillite, et du coup doivent à la fois arrêter de consommer et en même temps mettre en péril les établissements financiers qui sont intermédiaires, qui portent leurs dettes auprès des créanciers.
And once the house prices stopped growing, the whole house of cards collapsed.
Les ménages ont perdu sur deux fronts. Ils ont perdu parce que la valeur de l'immobilier s'est effondrée, et puis parce que la bourse s'est effondrée. Donc cette chute générale des prix va se conjuguer à la chute générale de l'activité pour rendre difficile pour mettre en insolvabilité tous les emprunteurs.
As business failed, they couldn't repay the loans. The only way they could do it by borrowing more and more. But that process had to come to an end.
Et pour les ménages américains, ça signifie que tout d'un coup, ils se sont retrouvés pauvres. Mais c'est un choc psychologique absolument considérable. Les ménages américains qui pensaient qu'ils pouvaient se dispenser d'épargner pour préparer leurs vieux jours, parce que la bourse silencieusement leur préparait leur retraite, cette idée s'est effondrée.
They thought that they had made their life, and then suddenly the floor dropped out from under them, and they started to lose it all again. I mean, who's hurt by a depression? The poor have always been poor. You know, this is not anything particularly new to them. It's a little harder. The rich, if you've got $20 million and you lose 10 or 12 million, you can still scrape by on that other 8 million. It's the middle class, the ones who are new to that lifestyle. And the middle class on that level, as I said, because of the consumer economy, was grounded in the possession of material things, whether it's an automobile, whether it's clothes, whether it's your house or whatever. And all of that is one by one taken away from them.
And so the economy continues to descend and descend and descend, no matter what Hoover is prepared to do, and he's prepared to do not very much.
The kinds of views that Hoover advocated were the kinds of policies that made the Great Depression as bad as it was. He refused to really have the kind of stimulus that the country needed. There was really a lack of comprehension of the depth of the problems and the appropriate policies to respond to it.
The results of the World War and its aftermath.
To boost the confidence of the financial world, Hoover decided to urgently repatriate to the U.S. capital loaned to Germany. This was a devastating measure and a monumental mistake. Germany, which was barely recovering from the war, was hit hard by the withdrawal of American capital.
The effect was simply to cut the flows of money that had previously, in the middle of the 1920s, moved from the United States to Europe and had fed an economic boom.
World War I was not forgotten in 1929. There was still a lot of anger, and the Depression gave the Hoover administration and the Republicans at the time the opportunity to vent their anger, among other things. There is no way it would have saved the day by repatriating that money.
Les propriétaires américains ont rapatrié leurs capitaux, ce qui a asséché des banques, qui a asséché l'économie allemande, etc. Et donc il y a eu un jeu avec les capitaux américains très déstabilisateur. Donc autrement dit, c'est une strangulation progressive qui était programmée.
I don't think they were fully aware of the implications of what they were doing.
L'histoire du monde a basculé à ce moment-là. C'est pas parce qu'aux États-Unis, on a connu pendant 2 ou 3 ans un taux de chômage à 25%. C'est pas ça ce qui fait qu'on reste traumatisé par la crise de 29. C'est parce qu'elle a traversé l'Atlantique et que le premier pays européen qui est touché par la crise, c'est l'Allemagne. Et la raison pour laquelle l'Allemagne est la première touchée, c'est que la reconstruction allemande n'a pu être faite en Allemagne que par le financement de capitaux américains qui se sont immédiatement retirés au premier moment de la crise de 1929, retirant le tapis sous les pieds de l'Allemagne.
The very first credit transfer spelled disaster for the German economy. The amount of the U.S. loans was staggering. The Reichsbank had to send 14 billion marks to the U.S. in gold and currency. Investors were ruined, the emptied banks were mobbed.
The international financial system and the way it worked clearly contributed to the spread of the crisis in Germany, and that led to contraction of the economy. So that was one of the factors that contributed to the downward spiral.
What had been a local affair, that is a largely American affair, becomes a European-wide depression in a continent which itself has been suffering almost for the whole decade from a very weak economy. Not like the United States. Europe hadn't been booming during the 20s, but in fact was suffering all the consequences of a devastating World War I, only was beginning to rebuild its industry and its agricultural economy and so on.
Germany had been in an economic mess all through the 1920s. Remember the horrendous mega inflation of the 1920s just about wiped out the German middle class in the 1920s. And a lot of that was the spillover from the horrible terms of the Versailles Treaty.
Those debts, war reparation debts and war loan debts, hang over the economy, depressing it further until finally the depression spreads from the United States to Europe.
Les capitaux américains, l'Allemagne en avait besoin, parce que pour financer justement les réparations dont une partie ont été payées, eh bien l'Allemagne s'est endettée.
And when you look at the German deal, that what Germany got vis-a-vis France, and what France did to Germany in that period, and what the UK along with France did, and what the US allowed to happen to Germany, we hurt Germany in a way that damaged stable democracy, of course.
Et la France a tout fait pour favoriser l'extrême droite. On est parti de l'idée, puisque l'économie allemande va mal, c'est que c'est bénéficiaire pour la France. Et ça, c'était faux.
Il y a eu en fait un processus dans lequel, à mon avis, les Français se sont révélés aveuglés par leur désir de revanche et il fait l'erreur colossale. Et évidemment, la crise est arrivée là-dessus. La crise n'a rien arrangé.
C'est une république qui recommence à exister, à respirer. Et c'est 1929 qui a cassé cette dynamique, qui a immédiatement, sur un corps fragilisé par les crises antérieures, rouvert la plaie. Alors pour moi, il n'y a pas de doute possible que c'est la crise de 1929 qui a provoqué cette montée aux extrêmes. Et la crise est venue frapper un corps malade, fatigué, qui n'a trouvé d'issue que dans le nazisme.
In Germany, industrial production collapsed, bankruptcies increased, and the number of unemployed reached over 6 million, leading to widespread disillusionment and anger. Hunger marches were held in several cities, and soup kitchens sprang up once again.
Nous habitions dans la Mendelssohnstraße et je me souviens de ma grand-mère distribuant une sorte de soupe à l'entrée et je demandais qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? C'est pour les chômeurs. C'est la première fois que j'ai entendu le mot chômeur.
Il y a un parallélisme tout à fait étonnant entre l'Allemagne et les États-Unis tout au long de cette période. Dans les deux cas, le taux de chômage va monter à 25% et on va voir exactement le même effondrement à la fois des prix et de la production qu'aux États-Unis. Les pays européens vont absorber la crise d'une manière qui va être plus ou moins tragique, mais qui ne sera jamais aussi spectaculaire que ce qu'on observera aussi bien en Allemagne qu'aux États-Unis.
In the United States, the shockwave of the stock exchange collapse had not subsided before the effects of the terrible, irreversible spiral of recession began to be felt. American industrial production dropped by half. Thousands of families had to rely on the soup kitchen for food.
The economy did not recover, and by June, because spring was usually the big month for when the economy begins to perk up for the coming season, didn't happen. And as a result, the bottom just sort of fell out of the market again, and the country drifted along until about October. And it's not until really about October of 30 that the country begins to fall into a depression.
America's sturdiest strongholds collapsed after the Wall Street crash. It was in stark contrast to the recent period of rapid growth. 1 worker in 5 was unemployed. The population seemed anesthetized. In New York, where every month 17,000 families were put on the streets, hundreds of thousands of unemployed, including many white-collar workers, struggled to survive, trudging through the cold for hours just to get a bowl of soup and a piece of bread.
The government has no safety programs, no safety net welfare programs. There is no unemployment insurance. So as people lose jobs and they're thrown on the streets, they have nowhere to go but to private charities. And those private charities are just completely overwhelmed.
My early memories of the Depression was seeing my mother standing on one of these lines to get food, ashamed of being poor, ashamed of having to ask somebody for something. I remember that, very vividly, because it was very painful to see her on this line waiting to get some food. As the Depression got worse, we moved from bad tenements to worse tenements. Of course, another thing I remember is my own family. My father was a waiter When the Depression came, there was less work, and so my father had to do many other things. And desperately, he became a salesman of ties, of neckties, because I remember I felt very ashamed. Walking past down the street to school, and there was my father selling ties on the street, and to this day, I'm ashamed of my own reaction. And another time, he became a window cleaner, and he did that until he fell from one of his window cleaning jobs and hurt himself. And I remember my father doing some cleaning streets or something like that.
And that's part of the awful tragedy of the Depression. It's literally etched on the faces of people. Men get up and they go out to look for work, and they know they're not going to find anything. And so they're going to spend half the day sitting on a park bench feeling useless.
It was a reality that it was very difficult to escape from. I think you couldn't go anywhere without seeing the signs of depression. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing the boarded up stores, the factories that were not working, the people standing on the street. In the early phases of the Depression, many men, for instance, still dressed up as if they were going to work because they didn't want to tell their families. They were too embarrassed to tell their families that they were unemployed, but then they would stand around in their work clothing all day in the street to be away from home, to be somewhere else.
Broken by the recession and prepared to do anything to survive, more and more people took part in numerous dance marathons, a 1930s variant of ancient circus games. The rule of these trials was simple. Couples had to dance for as long as possible, sometimes for several days, in the hope of winning the $500 awarded to the last couple standing, to the delight of the audiences who came to forget their own misery. The organizers thought of everything: doctors, beds, and food. The losers at least got the chance to eat.
That's one of the things that I remember. Of course, another thing I remember is people being evicted from their tenements. Even as low as the rents were, they could not afford to pay them. And so the police would come, they'd take their furniture and put them out on the street. And I remember as a little boy going by these scenes of furniture out on the streets, and you know, you might see the mother crying, weeping, you know, because it was not only that they had lost their home, but it was psychologically humiliating for them to have all of their possessions in full view of everybody, and for everybody to know that they could not pay their rent. But once or twice I saw scenes of rebellion, people organizing to move the furniture back, to defy the police, and this happened several times.
People, as they lost their homes, had to go somewhere, and they went largely into these makeshift huts that they put together with cardboard and tin and leftover materials. They slept in caves in Central Park.
There are tent cities all over America of homeless people that are called Hoovervilles in mocking disdain for what Hoover has visited upon the country.
Central Park in New York City had a number of Hoovervilles, and Hoovervilles were for a number of years, the shame of our society.
Once I lived the life of a millionaire, spending my money, Lord, I didn't care. I carried my friends out for a mighty good time, buying bootleg liquor, champagne and wine. Then I begun to fall so low. Didn't have no money and no place to go. If I get my hands on a dollar again, I'm gonna hold on to it till the eagle grins, because nobody knows you when you're down and out. In your pockets, not one penny, and your friends, you have not any. But when you get on your feet again, everybody wants to be your long-lost friend. It's mighty strange.